Pastor Phil has been doing this series of Zeros into Heroes, and at Mother's Day, it just didn't work out that he asked me if I wanted to speak, and I couldn't work it out at that time. So he said, when you do speak, I want you to speak on Esther, which I immediately said yes. So then we had this cross-communication, and I didn't realize it was this week until Wednesday or Thursday. So I'm asking you to pray, 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 and that God will help me through to say what he wants to say. But I zeros into heroes, and the first is when God seems to be out of the picture. Have you ever been in a place in your life where you felt so far away from God that you were unsure if he knew where you were? Did you wonder if God was mad at you? Have you ever wondered that? I have. God, are you mad at me? We know better, but sometimes we feel that way. He felt so far away from me when we moved back here in 2005. But let me start back a little bit. As we come back here in 2005, Pastor Phil had a job. He was going to be the music pastor. And so a good friend of mine, Jeannie Bailey, recommended me for a job at the Christian school to teach music. So I, over the phone, interviewed, talked with the administrator at the time, and he hired me over the phone. And I was excited. Here we were coming back here. Pastor Phil had a job back here in People's Church, and I was going to be teaching. It was going to be extra income for us. It was going to help us with our insurance. And it seemed like everything was going our way. But circumstances changed, and they changed drastically, quickly. After my initial hiring over the phone, God changed the leadership or the administration of this Christian school. So when I showed up in June, no one knew who I was, and they said, come back in August. And I came back in August, and I didn't really have a job because the former administrator had forgot to tell anybody that he'd hired me or that I was supposed to teach certain classes, and what he and I had agreed upon was gone. Now, I'm not getting on the administration. It wasn't their fault. They were just as surprised as I was. So they worked hard to get me a desk and some into the schedule, and I taught before school, I taught after school, I tutored, I taught singing, music in the gymnasium, and it was difficult. It was extremely difficult. And during the year, I felt like God was saying to me, you know what, this position is not going to last as a full-time position next year. And I was mad. I was mad. I was mad at God. I was mad at people. I didn't understand. I thought this was what God had done and what God had wanted. And I felt like God was so far away from me. And I had to put my kids in public school. My kids had never been in public school. Now, I'm not knocking public school because I'd grown up in public school. But God had so many plans that I couldn't even see yet. But I couldn't get through the immediate thing. Didn't God understand that it was hard enough to uproot my kids and bring them back to Beloit? And Phil and I sit there in a house we rented, and then first night of school, I heard all three of them crying as they went to sleep. Didn't he understand how hard it was anyway? And now I'm going to probably lose my job because if it goes to part-time, the kids can't go to Christian school for free. But he gave me the insight to go ahead and apply for school of choice, and I did. And sure enough, the administrators, as kind as they were, explained to me that their plans and what I had planned just didn't match up. And they blessed me, and they were kind to me as they said, you know, if you want the part-time job, you can have it. I just didn't feel like that's what God was supposed to do. And I tell you what, I fell into a deep depression. And I look over at Carrie, And I think about if it weren't for Carrie and Beth Koopman and some others who came and visited me during that time, I don't know what I'd have done, because they kept pulling on me, saying, you're going to get through this, and they kept encouraging me. And I felt so all alone. And I just wanted you to know that I felt like God had left. I didn't think he was hearing my prayers. I didn't think he understood who I was. I didn't think he had anything to do with the fact that I got a new job, because I did. But you know what? God never leaves his creation, ever. And that's something we always have to remember. He has not lost you. I believe that the book of Esther, or the character of Esther, had many of those feelings. The Israelites had been out of the promised land for 132 years. They had been in captivity. Esther was an orphan. She was a young virgin, and her cousin Mordecai had adopted her and raised her as his own daughter, and began to teach her the history and the ways of the Israelites, and she continued to live in this pagan land. And I wonder if she ever felt like God had left her there. I wonder if she ever experienced some of those same feelings. God has never left, but we can't find him in our circumstances. We have to rely on our faith. And actually, we have to lean on the faith we have in him and know that he is there. Lean on his promises. And I believe the book of Esther will bring us hope to all, and with hope we can endure. So let me tell you a little bit about Esther. We'll start reading in a little while, but first let me tell you a little bit about Esther. It's a great book. It's a book I hope that all of you read. It's one of my favorites. It's written in a narrative form, which means it's told like a story. So I just love Esther. King Xerxes, and he's called King Xerxes in some places, and he's called King Ashurbanipal in other places. I'm going to stick with Xerxes because I really can't say the other name. Okay, so King Xerxes is the king of Persia, which means he's the most powerful king in all of the land. I mean all of the land. They go almost from India to Greece. That's how much of, at that time, of land that they ruled. And he decided in his third year that he was going to have a party. Now, you know, we throw parties. We're going to have a picnic on the 22nd. But he threw a party for all the kings, the military, the nobles, the princes, the governors, and anybody else he thought or who thought they were important. And he had them come to the city of Susa, which he was having built as a fortress to protect him. So while he was throwing that party, he decided to let it go for 6 months. Well, it was 160 days, so almost 6 months. Now that is a person who knows how to throw a party. 6 months he's partying. And after that 160 days, he throws another party. This time he decides to throw a party for the entire city or fortress of Susa. So if you lived within the walls of Susa, you were invited to a party. Now all the men were invited to his party, and it didn't matter if you were the greatest or the least. It didn't matter if you were the wealthiest or the poorest, the smartest or the dumbest. It didn't matter. You were all invited. The men's party was held in the court of the palace, and it was beautiful, and it describes it in the book of Esther, and I can't even imagine what it looked like. But it was in an extravagant place, and he told his servants that no matter how much they asked for wine, never say no. Give it to them. So, the party was held for a week. He only held this one for a week, but the wine kept flowing day after day through the night. As much wine as they could drink. There's a lot of wine. But in the meantime, the queen, who was Vashti, and I found out that Vashti was actually part of the Babylonian royalty, and that she had been conquered, that their area had been conquered, and she had been given to Xerxes as his queen. So she was holding a party for the women inside the castle. And on the last day, The king, high in spirits, it said, with his wine, goes to his eunuch and says, would you please come and have Vashti come with her royal crown and come out and show her beautiful glory so that he would be glorified to have such a beautiful wife. He thought she was eye candy, and he wanted to show her off. So the eunuchs go to Vashti and tell her what he wants, and she sends back word. But the word was no. No, you don't tell the most powerful man in the world no. And he was furious. He was so furious that he called for his most trusted advisors, and he said, now what do I do? Now I love this. I love this. I don't mean to get on you men, but this is hilarious what they said. He says that all of his advisors get around and say, you know what you need to do? You need to send out a decree saying that you're going to depose the queen Vashti. In other words, you're going to get rid of her. She won't be queen anymore. And that you're going to look for another beautiful woman in the kingdom to replace her. Now, they said the reason we want to do this is because we are afraid that the women of this kingdom are going to start despising their husbands. Because Vashti treated you mean, all the women of all of Persia are going to be mean to their husbands. And they're not going to show them respect. Boy, men worry about respect, don't they? So they convinced him to send out this decree, and this would make certain that all men, no matter what rank, would receive the proper respect from their wives. Like a decree would do that. This sounds like a wise decree. And so in all the languages of all the people, it took a lot to get this out, because you imagine all of that. There were many languages spoken. They had to write out this law in every language, and they sent them out. Now, King Xerxes misses his wife later on. And so we're in chapter 2. So his personal assistants then set out and get their agents to gather up the young virgin women and bring them to Susa so that they can become under the care of a eunuch named Haggai. They were to be given beauty treatments, and each one was to be brought before the king. And after that, the woman who pleased the king would be named or crowned queen, and Vashti would no longer be queen. So as a result of this decree, Esther, who I imagine, and I wondered where she was, and it doesn't really say, but Esther, I imagine, was still probably close to the land of Babylon, because that's where the Jews had been taken to. So in wherever city she lived, she was gathered up, and I remember a Sunday school lesson book where it showed them, and they put them all in the back of a wagon, and a donkey pulled them. I have no idea how they traveled, but it looked like they kind of, put them up like cattle and took them away. But I don't know how they got there. But all of these women started pouring into Susa, and they went into what was called harem number 1. Now, when they call harem 1, harem really refers to the building or area of the palace where the virgins would stay. And there, they were under the care of Haggai, like the decree said. They were supposed to get 12 months of beauty treatment. Wow. The first 6 months was oil with myrrh. So their bodies were to get oiled and have myrrh, and it's supposed to have healing properties. So I was reading one commentary, so if they had fungus, it would kill it. I don't know. I have no idea. But the first 6 months was all oil. And then the second 6 months, they were to be treated with cosmetics and perfumes, saffron, which smells, I think is beautiful, all different kinds of perfumes that they could create, and so that their bodies were beautiful, they smelled wonderful. And then they were supposed to go before the king. Then, so when Esther comes in, Haggai sees her and says there's something different about her. He finds favor with her almost immediately. So he takes her, and first thing he does is order her a special menu. She gets fed differently than all the others. And then the second thing he does is he gets 7 handmaidens from the palace and has them wait on her hand and foot. And then he moves her to another area of the harem that was the best place in all the harem. So I wonder, I have a feeling everybody knew she was treated specially. I have no idea. But she was humble and she was kind, or she wouldn't have been treated this way, I'm sure. Esther didn't tell anybody of her nationality. She didn't tell anyone that she was a Jew because Mordecai had said, whatever you do, do not let them know about your nationality. And every day, Mordecai had followed her to the city of Susa, and every day he would walk by the courtyard and find out, because you know, servants gossip. The servants know everything. So he would get word from one of the servants how she was doing, what was happening to her, what was going to happen to her that day. And he would make sure she was okay because Mordecai had grown to love her so much as his daughter. And so he took care of her. Now, before each woman was taken to the king's bed, and after she'd had her 6 months of treatments, she was allowed to take any clothing, jewelry, anything that she wanted with her. And she went into the king's private rooms, and the next morning she was brought to the second harem, which is another area of the palace. And there she was put under another eunuch's care, and that took care of the concubines and the wives. And she would never see the king again unless he called her name. So this is the process of what's going to happen. Remember that Esther had found favor with the eunuch, and because of her personality, I'm adding a little here, maybe her humility, she received the best of everything, the best food, the handmaidens, the best place. And then when it was time for Esther to go see the king, what did she do? But she said, Haggai, you tell me what to do. You tell me what to wear. You tell me what to take. Because she knew that Haggai knew the king. And if she wanted to be queen, that she needed to follow the advice of someone else. So Haggai told her. Now, let's look at chapter 2, verses 15 through 18. I'm in the New Living Translation, so if it reads a little differently, I'm sorry. Esther was taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in the early winter of the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than any other young woman. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen instead of Vashti. To celebrate the occasion, he gave a banquet in Esther's honor for all of the nobles and officials, and he even made a public holiday for the provinces and giving generous gifts to everyone. So after the celebration then, after all of that was over, Esther is queen, harem 1, then at some point is moved to harem 2. Don't know why, how, not going to talk about that. Also during this time though, Mordecai, who is moved to Susa, becomes part of the king's palace staff, and he guards the gates. So Mordecai now has a job that he is known to be trustworthy of. So he is considered trustworthy. And while he is there, he hears 2 of the eunuchs mad at the king, and he says, you know what? We're going to kill him tonight. And they plot to kill him. He immediately sends word to Queen Esther, and Queen Esther gets word to the King Xerxes and says, Mordecai has heard this, and Mordecai has foiled the plan. And you need to do something about this. And so those 2 eunuchs were killed, and the plot against King Xerxes was foiled. But the unusual thing is, Mordecai wasn't rewarded for what he had done. I mean, usually if you saved the life of the king, that was a big deal. But everything was written down in what they called the history book of the King Xerxes, but there was nothing written about his reward. Unusual, but there's a reason for it. And let's begin reading chapter 3 then. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, over all the nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All of the king's officials would bow before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow or show him respect. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's commands?" They spoke to him day after day, but he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke with Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all of the Jews in the entire empire of Persia. Now, this is not a coincidence that Haman is in a rage. It's not a coincidence that he got even madder when he found out that he was a Jew. It's not even a coincidence that instead of killing Haman, he decides to kill all of the Jews, because this was part of God's plan because of something else that happened. I won't go into the whole story, but if you look in 1 Samuel 15, you'll remember a story about King Saul. Now, King Saul was ordered by God to attack the Amalekites. He said, "The Amalekites were evil to my people as they tried to come into the promised land. They'd attacked them over and over again. They had killed many of them. They were just an evil, evil people." So he said, "Saul, I want you to attack the Amalekites. I want you to kill every livestock. I want you to kill every person, every child, every mother. I want them to completely be wiped out." When Samuel came to visit Saul, he found out that he hadn't done that. Well, he had attacked them, and he had killed most of them, but he had kept King Agag alive. And with that, and he'd also kept livestock alive. Well, somewhere in that, and the story goes on that Samuel ends up killing King Agag. But somewhere in the lineage of King Agag was Haman the Agagite. And so that is why he hated the Jews. He had a rage burning in his heart for them. And he wanted to make sure they were annihilated. And that deep hatred would show itself. So let's go to chapter 3, verse 8. Haman approached King Xerxes and said, "There is a certain race of people scattered throughout all the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's interest to let them live." See how he's applying, or he's looking toward king's jealousy and his pride. If they don't obey you, then you surely can't let them live. "So if it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury." Not only was he mad, he was going to give money to make sure that all the Jews were killed. Well, the king agreed, confirming his decision by removing his signet ring from his finger and giving it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said, "The money and the people are yours to do with as you see fit." So on April 17th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Haman dictated. It was to the king's highest officers, to the governors of their respective provinces, and the nobles of each province in their own scripts and languages. The decree was written in the name of the king Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Dispatches were sent by swift messengers into all the provinces of the empire, giving orders that all Jews, young and old, women, children, and men, must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated in a single day. This schedule was supposed to happen on March 7th of the next year. And the property of the Jews would go to the ones who had killed them. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all the people so they would be ready to do their duty on the appointed day. At the king's command, the decree went out by swift messengers, and it was proclaimed also there in the fortress of Susa. Then the king and Haman sat down to drink. But Susa fell into confusion. The city right there was so confused. And I can understand that. Wasn't like the king. To order the death and the annihilation of children and women and men and to take their property, this was not like the king. And they didn't understand. And there were many Jews who were living in the city of Susa. So I'm sure they were asking, what has the king done? But as surprised as they were, God was not surprised. He knew that an Amalekite, especially the Agagite, would again attack his people, and he had a plan in place. A plan to use a Jewish palace guard and a young woman who had all the beauty but no authority to save the thousands of lives of his chosen people. Mordecai found out immediately, and as soon as he did, he let all of the Jewish people know, and then he went to sackcloth and ashes. He wore burlap, and he fasted, and he fasted. And finally, word got back to Queen Esther, and she heard about it, and she was so worried about Mordecai, she sent in clothes and said, take these and take off that burlap. It has to be awful to wear. And he refused it. And so she sent another assistant and said, why are you refusing this? What is bothering you so much? So he told her about the edict. And he said, it is your people and you who are in trouble because of this law that has been passed. And now it's your job to go to the king and tell him that he can't do this and stop it. I think she was scared to death. I think she was scared to death. I think there are times in our lives we all get scared to death when we know the right thing to do, but we don't know how it's going to turn out. We don't know how they're going to react, and we get scared. I think that Esther was scared. She sent word back to Mordecai and said, don't you remember that if someone enters the inner court of the king without being invited, he is doomed if the king doesn't stretch out his scepter and welcome you? She had not seen the king for over 30 days, she reminded him. And so Mordecai sent back a message encouraging her to take a leap of faith and live out her destiny. He asked her the question, who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this? Who knows if you were made a mom for such a time as this? You could put anything in there because all of us have a destiny and all of us have a purpose. And we could put any word in there. Do you have a destiny? Has God called you to do something for him? It's hard to figure out sometimes, and sometimes it's blatantly right there in front of you. I believe this is the reason God put Esther and the life of Esther in the Bible, so that we could understand that we can have faith and step out in that. This topic today may be for someone here in the audience, or it may be for someone who hears the message on the computer. Esther began to understand that she had to do this. So she sent word to Mordecai, and she asked him to do one thing. She said, I want you to have all of the Jewish people in the city fast from water and drink, food and water, for 3 days. And me and my handmaidens will do the same. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever fasted, but I have never fasted from food and water for 3 days. I don't think I've ever gotten through a day. You know, it's not an easy thing. Fasting, and then you'll hear people say, oh, there's all kinds of fasting. You can fast from music or you can fast from TV, and those are all very true. But fasting from food and water was a very difficult thing. But during that fasting, they were showing that they were praying, that they were looking to God for help. So at the third day of the fast, Esther puts on her beautiful royal robes, and she goes into the outer garden. Oh, I think I may be wrong on that. She goes into the inner court of the palace. This is a place where the king can see her. Well, the king saw her, and he smiled. And immediately he welcomed her, and he reached out his scepter toward her, and to show her that he had pleasure in seeing her. She reached up, and then her responsibility as he reaches out the scepter was to touch it. And so she touches the scepter, and immediately the king says, "What do you want? What do you need, my queen? Ask me anything, even half the kingdom, and I will give it to you." And she says, "All I ask of you is that you and Haman come to a banquet I have prepared in my quarters." "Okay, Haman, come on, let's go." And out they went. And so they went to a banquet. And I'm sure it was lavish. I'm sure it tasted wonderful. The king seemed very satisfied. And so they're drinking wine, it says, and he looks at her again. He says, "Okay, now, please tell me, what is it you need? What is it you want? I'll give you half the kingdom." He gives offer again. I'm so surprised she didn't take it. But she doesn't. So she says, "All I ask of you, if you have found pleasure in me, and you find pleasure in granting me what I wish, all I ask of you is that you come to a banquet again tomorrow night. Tomorrow evening, you and Haman are invited." And he said, "We will do this." So after they left, and I got to find my notes. After they left, Haman is walking out of the palace, and guess who's out at the gate? Mordecai. And guess what Mordecai does not do? He doesn't bow, and he doesn't show homage to him. And he is enraged. He goes home, and this is something funny because we all do this. I am the worst of offenders. Is I go home and I start talking to my family, and I'm like, "Do you know what happened today?" Now, he gets all of his friends around, he gets his wife around, and he's telling them how he's been promoted to prime minister, he's promoted to above all palace officials there, and they all have to honor them. He was even invited to a banquet with the queen and the king alone, no one else. He's just going on and on. And then he gets to Mordecai, and he says, "You know what? Mordecai won't bow to me, and because of that, all of this wonderful stuff is ruined. I don't feel any happiness whatsoever." But he does exactly what I do. I'm the same way. I go complain to somebody. And so his wife comes up with a great idea. Don't we do that, Julie? We do. Come up with a great idea. She says, "You know what? Why don't you have a pole 75 feet high that is sharpened on the top, set into the ground, and you have Mordecai impaled upon that pole. You go ask the king and you say, 'He is not honoring me, he is not bowing to me like you've decreed, so I want him to be killed.'" And he thinks, good idea. So he orders the pole set up. Well, the next part shows God's humor. It's one of those times that I just think, I just know God has a great, great sense of humor. I married my husband. That's one of the ways I know. He makes me laugh all the time. But doesn't God have a great sense of humor? So Haman comes in the next morning, and he is ready. He's ready to go to the king, and the first thing he's going to do is he's going to tell him about Mordecai so Mordecai can die that morning so he can be happy and go to the banquet happy as a clam. But what he doesn't know is what God has done in the night. God is always working, even when we don't see him. Because King Xerxes couldn't sleep. And so because he couldn't sleep and he was tossing and turning, I don't know about you, but a lot of times, many people they can't sleep, they get up and they read a book. Well, King Xerxes decided to read a book or have a book read to him, and it was the book of the history of King Xerxes. And so he goes back over the events day by day until they get to this certain day where a plot to have him killed was foiled, and the person who was responsible for him being alive was Mordecai. And he said, so what reward was he given? And the scribe or whoever was reading it said, there's nothing written down. He was not ever rewarded. So the king can't wait. He wants to make up for his mistake. And so he is ready to honor Mordecai. Haman is ready to kill Mordecai. And here we go. I can just see this. Haman comes into where the inner court, and he starts to talk to the king, and the king asks him a question. The king says, Haman, I'm glad you're here. You're the first one here, so you're a good person to ask. If I were going to honor someone greatly and let all of the people know that I valued him, that I honored him above all others, that I wanted to reward him in every way, what would you think would be the great reward that I could do? Well, Haman, who is selfish, angry, mad, he's thinking in a whole different direction. He's thinking, he must be ready to reward me. So he gives him this answer. He says, well, if it were me, I would have the royal robes put on me, he didn't say me, but he thought me, on the person. I would let him ride your white horse. I would have him wear a kingly dress, something on his head. And he said, I would have someone of great influence leading the horse around and saying that he is honored above all for what he has done. And see, he's imagining himself on that horse, being honored. And he's probably imagining Mordecai running around saying that because Mordecai won't honor him. But so he's going on and on about what he thinks that this person should say. And the king says, good idea. Mordecai is the person, and you're going to lead the horse. Now, doesn't God have a sense of humor? So that same morning, Haman has to go to Mordecai and tell him that he is going to put him on the horse. He puts him on the horse, puts on kingly robes and a headdress, and he has to walk around, and you can read this in Esther, and he is calling out at his loudest voice, because if he doesn't do it, he's going to die. He's going to go against the decree of the king. He calls out in his loudest voice that he has honored the king, and he is wonderful. He is above all other guards or all other people in the palace. For I don't know how long, but it seems like, according to the scriptures, a long time that morning, he did that. I can't imagine what Haman felt. I can't imagine what Mordecai felt. But I imagine God smiled. Don't you? I imagine he really, really smiled. So after his plan has been foiled, he comes back, and immediately the eunuchs come and get him and say it's time to go to the banquet. Well, Mordecai's still alive. He's been embarrassed completely, and he's mad as mad can be. And he goes to the banquet. And there at the banquet, of course, he has a lavish meal, and he's filled till he can't eat anymore, and they're drinking wine. And the king asks the same question again. Queen Esther, what is it that you want? What can I do for you? I'll give you half the kingdom. And she says, all I ask is that you spare my life and the life of my people, because their lives have been sold. And it goes on, and she says, if they've been sold into slavery, I would not say anything. But because they've been sold unto death, I had to bring this to you. And the king is surprised and shocked. Remember, he does not know, till this point, she is a Jew. And so she reveals to him that she is a Jew, and the edict that was to come about on March 7th. The king is so furious, he says, "Who would do such a thing to my queen?" And she points to Haman and says, "That man is the man who hates the Jews." Well, the king is so upset, he goes outside to the terrace. While he is there, Haman is terrified. Haman is so scared that he pleads with the queen. Now, the queen, according to the scriptures, was on a lounging couch, and he falls on her, begging, please, for her life. Well, you know how it looks. Here comes the king. Here's Haman falling upon the queen, and he is furious. He's had enough. He calls his guards, and he says, "Cover his face," which was a way to say, "You're dead." So they covered his face, and he's trying to consider what's going to happen. And one of the guards says, "Why don't we put him on the pole that he had planned for Mordecai?" And that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened. But that's not the end of the story. There's still more in the book of Esther. I encourage you to read the whole book, because after that, just because Haman is dead doesn't mean that March 7th doesn't come. It comes. But the king writes another edict that the Jews could protect themselves. So make sure you read the whole story, because this shows from beginning to end how God works in so many different ways. It was the working of God through a pagan king, a kind, loyal servant, and a humble young woman that saves the lives of the chosen people. And what I want you to take away today is this: God brings about his plan through the miracles he performs. And sometimes the miracles are ordinary people in certain circumstances, in extraordinary circumstances. Oh, I changed this, didn't I? Sometimes the miracles are that he uses ordinary people to do extraordinary things. Now, Pastor Phil has reminded us of that over and over. He has used so many people in this church who you consider yourselves ordinary to do extraordinary things. There's some people I know your stories, and there's some people in here that I don't know your stories. But I know that God has used you to do extraordinary things. But you don't stop with one or two. You don't stop teaching just because you've taught for 40 years, do you, Norma? You don't stop, do you? Ordinary things, extraordinary things. She's just an ordinary person, she thinks, but we know she's done extraordinary things. And there's so many other stories that we could tell. But you don't stop with one or two or three. You continue to go on, because the miracle of God is that he uses us to do extraordinary things.